I think that Chaplin was a very thorough and professional musician in terms of how he saw music serving not only the image but also just life in general. It's always been around him. Both his parents were English music hall singers, and it's always been a major part of his life. The only thing that tends to disqualify him in the eyes of other musicians is the fact that he couldn't read music. Chaplin composed music on the violin because he was quite a good violinist, which has been evident on the recordings that we got of him playing on the original violin parts from Limelight, and also on the piano. He played a little bit of organ and he played a little bit of cello, but according to Stan Laurel, his cello playing was so awful that he didn't want anybody to hear him playing it very often. So I think he just composed on the violin and the piano, and he would have a musical associate who would write down what he was playing, either on the piano or on the violin, and then from there make a short score and time it out with all the metronome marks, and then give it to a copyist. They would give it to an orchestra, and they would record this piece, and he would hear it and go, yeah, that's good, that's not so good. In Chaplin's life, music has always been a big part of what he did theatrically in terms of the Carno Company. And I think that he always probably imagined making music with the early films, but in fact didn't actually compose his first film until 1931. So in effect, the earlier films, such as the Burlesque, up into the Mutuals, they were all without music, and he didn't really start thinking about composing until much later in life, almost midway. Music in cinemas during that time was really dependent on the city in which you went. If you were in New York City, for example, you would go to the Roxy and you'd have a 40-piece orchestra there on a nightly basis, doing 2, sometimes 3 shows a night. Whereas you go to somewhere like Baker, Oregon, you'll get my Aunt Doris playing the piano, and you know, believe me, that's much less refined experience. However, that would be very typical. Just someone who would have a photo book that they would play various numbers by Domenico Savino or Zamanchnik or various composers that were in the catalog for cinema players. And they would just improvise, or if they weren't very good at improvising, they would just play something that would say melodrama, and they would play melodrama. Or in the case of Chaplin, they would do, you know, Funny Walk, or they would do, you know, Comic Heroique or something, you know, that would be very generic but funny. But of course, Chaplin, of course, believed that the music shouldn't necessarily be funny, which is why one of the reasons I think he was compelled to compose was because when he saw his films accompanied by other pianists who would just play ragtimes or something rather on the rather light and funny side, I don't think he really thought that served the music very well, or served the film very well. Especially the fact that when he was with the Carno Company, they had music going in their act that was rather on the delicate side. I mean, they were playing with a drunkard, you know, such as like in 1 a.m., I would definitely hear something like the Minuet of Boccherini or something played, something that would counteract the comedy. And I believe that was a philosophy that served him very well. Chaplin had seen the Carmen of DeMille, and from what I understood, he enjoyed it very much, but it was also extremely popular, and he took the opportunity to take a popular film and put it through his eyes, so to speak, as the tramp. And he created something that looks almost exactly like the original Carmen in terms of the sets, even though I'm not sure what studio it was actually shot at in terms of the SNA, but it looks amazingly like the DeMille. It has the same textures, the same sort of feeling at it, except that instead of Don Jose, his name is Darn Hosiery, which cracks me up every time I see it. It's just a great parody of the DeMille, and that's why when I conduct it, I like to put the two together. Always do the Carmen first, because it's a beautiful film. But then the send-up comes afterwards, and it's quite funny. In fact, it's one of my favorite SNAs of them all, just because it's so classically treated. When I'm composing original music for a silent film, I watch the film several times, just with no music whatsoever. And then I look at each scene individually, kind of figure out a tempo, a color, a mood, and proceed accordingly. If it's a comedy, it's much more difficult. It takes 3 times as long, because you are doing everything that has to do with timing, and especially when you're doing Chaplin, there's a comedic rhythm that becomes quite obvious, because I believe that Chaplin made films like he did music, in terms of he would create a tempo and he would try different things until it kind of worked out rhythmically, and not necessarily editing, but just the way he moved. And musically, that's what you pay attention to, and you work towards that. In the case of the Burlesque, however, it's different, because of course I'm using the music of Bizet. But what I tried to do in this case was put the Bizet through the Chaplin grinder and just kind of see what came out. It's not easy using Bizet's music in this regard, because everybody knows the score. So it was rather difficult to figure out how to use it in a different way, as opposed to how Riesenfeld did it. But I used actually Riesenfeld's model for the music on how it attached to the film, because the Carmen Burlesque actually followed the DeMille quite closely. The most difficult thing about conducting the burlesque live is that, again, the rhythm that Chaplin utilizes on screen, you have to get the music to match that. And of course, you have to know the film very well. So it's a matter of being precisely like a metronome, but not sound like a metronome, and be as tightly synced with the film as possible. It's like a hand in a glove. With the DeMille Carmen, it's much easier. It's a little more broad, they're broader scenes, but Chaplin's never easy. It's always precise, just like the artist himself.